don't fully understand the science, and we're acting as if we do.
The environmental consequences of contamination with transgenic DNA are many. You know, people are manipulating or trying to manipulate corn, for example, to produce pharmaceuticals, to produce plastics, to produce, there is this horrendous spermicidal corn, there is also to produce that insecticide, also to be resistant to herbicides and so on. So you just dream it. Somebody is trying to manipulate corn for that purpose. So each one of those products, or so-called products, each one of those manipulations will have different consequences. The Bt producing corn, for example, the corn producing a toxin that kills insects, has serious consequences because it's leaking that insecticide into the environment, for example, through the roots. We now know that a lot of that Bt toxin goes into the soil and alters the microbial and insect community in the soil. That means the DNA that you are manipulating is not just any piece of DNA. It's a piece of DNA that has the property of inserting itself in different places. Wherever it finds an organism, wherever it finds a genome, it will insert itself quite successfully. That's why we manipulated it that way. So having that type of DNA released in the environment that we know is promiscuous, that we know is going to move more than any normal piece of DNA, is problematic. You can think of it as though you are introducing viruses and bacteria into the environment that have new reshuffled properties. We have been putting out hundreds of thousands of acres of these crops without really knowing what the consequences are, and just that lack of knowledge is problematic to me. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that it's really world food sustainability that's at stake.
The fact is, however, that what biotechnology does in agriculture is reduce biodiversity, which is one of the key ingredients in a healthy ecosystem. And of course, a healthy agriculture depends on a healthy ecosystem. They're after a quick fix, they're after a single solution, they're after the fastest dollar they can make on finding these quick solutions.
I don't have any scientific background. The only thing I know is what I've either done wrong or seen go wrong. I have a lot of hands-on experience. First of all, I don't buy the story that the genetically modified companies are putting out, that they're trying to do all these good things for us with genetic modifications. I don't buy it for a second. I feel that it's all about control and money and power from their part. I don't know how many people realize it, but there's kind of a neat circle in the pharmaceutical and crop production chemical business. If you look and do a little homework, you'll find that pretty well all the companies that are in the pharmaceutical business, Bayer, Upjohn Pharmacia, BASF, all of them are also in the crop production business. But it's more than a coincidence that, okay, if we put something on the crop that has an ill effect to the soil and to the crop, and it affects what we feed the livestock, and we ultimately feed the people, and the people get sick and they go to the doctor and then they need to go to the pharmacist and get a prescription. Kind of makes a complete circle for what's going on.
Well, there's several questions then in terms of, does genetic engineering offer us a way to address the hunger issue? So we can sort of take apart the industry argument and show why it doesn't make sense at any level. First, they say we need to produce more food. That's patently wrong. Right now we're producing too much food, driving food prices down, crop prices down, and farmers into poverty, generating poverty and hunger in rural areas throughout the world. In fact, what we need to do is control overproduction, especially in the United States and Europe, so that poor farmers around the world can get fair prices for what they produce. So the first part of their argument, we can debunk that. We don't need to produce more food now. Number two is, if we needed to produce more food now or in the future, would genetically engineering be a good way to do it? And in fact, genetic engineering fails on a whole number of grounds. First of all, the most commonly genetically engineered crops, the ones that are resistant to herbicide, actually produce less per acre or per hectare than non-genetically engineered crops. On the other hand, those that have their own pesticide in them, that's the second most common category of genetically engineered crops, produce a very slight advantage in productivity, but one which is lost after a few years as pests overcome the pesticide that's incorporated in the crop. So neither way, and certainly averaging it all out in the wash, is there any increased productivity to be expected from these crops. On the other hand, we have agroecological ways of which we can easily increase food production dramatically. We see that small farmers who combine several crops together in the same field, instead of the empty space between the rows and the typical industrial monoculture, produce much more total agricultural product per unit area than do monocultural farms. They may produce a lower yield of one of the component crops, but when you add together everything the small farmer produces, it's much more per acre or per hectare than large industrial farmers. And it's a way better way, should we need to produce more food in the future, to do it than through genetic engineering.
We stood up to Monsanto, and it went to trial. It ended up the Supreme Court of Canada, where everything they came after me, they lost. They lost the case, but the Supreme Court ruled that Monsanto's patent on a gene is valid. It doesn't matter how it ends up in any life form, they own and control it. And that was a startling decision, is that even if you have your crop, organic farmer or conventional farmer, and your crop is contaminated, the amount of contamination doesn't matter. They own your seeds and plants, and if you use them, you're liable to a lawsuit under patent law. So that's what the case is all about, and that shows how Monsanto can get control over the seed supply and food supply through cross-pollination, direct seed movement, blowing in the wind or whatever. It doesn't matter how it gets there, the court's ruled. You don't own your seeds or plants anymore. So it would give them, the corporations now, total control over the seed supply, ultimately the food supply.
Well, the main reason why biotechnology companies are so interested in promoting GMOs, first you have to understand that most of the biotech companies were the major investors in the chemical companies that promoted pesticides. And then they started buying the seed companies because they saw that the field of pesticide use was going to be highly regulated in the United States and Europe, and the markets were going to be actually affected heavily because of these regulations. So now they are now promoting the second revolution, which is the biotechnology revolution, based on the use of this genetic material, which they are starting to control increasingly, and increasingly controlling also the food system. And it's basically for profit motivations. There's no other reason why this technology should be promoted at the level it is. I mean, we don't need soybean that is resistant to herbicides, and we don't need to increase the production of soybean or maize. There is an overproduction actually in the United States of these products. And as a matter of fact, 70% of all the corn that is being produced is to feed cattle, not to feed people. So there's no need to promote this. The only need is the control of the food system, so that their products that they sell can be marketed by making farmers more dependent on agricultural inputs. So before farmers were dependent on just chemicals, now they are depending on a seed chemical package because it's engineered to make them dependent. The herbicide resistance is a specific case, and that's the dominant crop actually. So Monsanto is basically dominating increasingly the market, not only of the soybean, but also of the herbicides.
So there are probably thousands of traditional seed varieties, particularly wheat varieties, that are unique to that part of the world that are no longer legal for Iraqi farmers to grow.
Shouldn't unleash this massive experiment on huge numbers of farmers and consumers throughout the world in the absence of knowing what it's going to do. If it were a matter of life and death and survival, the risk might be worth it. But it's not a matter of life and death and survival. It may be a matter of life and death and survival for Monsanto and a few other chemical companies, but for most of us it isn't. We can eat perfectly good food without having it genetically modified.
It's interesting to note that people who want to see a sustainable agricultural system, who want to see organic fields and genetically engineered free crops, might get branded as marginal, might get branded as liberal or progressive, or even potentially unpatriotic. I find a great irony in that, because in my mind, the people who care about the local food system and who care about the integrity of the land and who care about growing food that's truly whole food are the true conservatives. So if I were going to reclaim a word for the organic food movement, for a food system that's free of genetically modified organisms, I would reclaim the word conservative. I think we are conservatives in the best sense of that word, and I think there's nothing more patriotic, if we think about patriotic in terms of meaning that we care about our country, we care about the place where we live, then we're the true patriots as well.